Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman. This work is a computer-generated reading of Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman. This work is free and licensed by Mitchell Heisman for copying and distribution under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivative Works 3.0 United States license. Creating God and the Evolution of Genetic Suicide. Why Liberal Democracy Leads to the Rational Biological Self-Destruction of Humans and the Rational Technological Creation of God. AGON, God versus the gods. 'Tis not the concern of a day, a year, or an age. Posterity are virtually involved in the contest, and will be more or less affected, even to the end of time, by the proceedings now. The least fracture now will be like a name engraved with the point of a pin on the tender rind of a young oak. The wound will enlarge with the tree, and posterity read it in full-grown characters. Quote by Thomas Paine, Common Sense. The farther backward you can look, the farther forward you are likely to see. Quote by Winston Churchill. Chapter name: Darwin's Genes. The liberal democratic era is coming to an end because the Homo sapien era is coming to an end. The ability to genetically engineer humans into new species and the advent of strong artificial intelligence will enable inequalities so extreme that the human boundaries within which liberal democracy has been a viable political form will be exploded. It makes no difference whether it is genetic engineering or artificial intelligence that overtakes humans. These new forms of progress will render human equality obsolete. The question is not whether liberal democracy will come to an end, but how liberal democracy will come to an end. Yet one cannot even begin to address such issues without a clear grasp of evolution. One cannot understand how liberal democracy is evolving without an evolutionary understanding of liberal democracy itself. On the most basic level, one must begin with a solid grasp of what biological evolution is. Evolution, explained biologist Richard Dawkins, is the process by which some genes become more numerous and others less numerous in the gene pool. It is good to get into the habit, whenever we are trying to explain the evolution of some characteristic, such as altruistic behavior, of asking ourselves simply, what effect will this characteristic have on frequency of genes in the gene pool? 1219. What effect do the modern legal principles of human equality, human rights, and feminism have on the frequency of genes in the gene pool on a global level? The one undoubted global change is of lesser consequence, wrote sociobiologist D.O. Wilson. It is the shift occurring worldwide in the frequency of racial traits such as skin color, hair type, lymphocyte proteins, and immunoglobulins, due to more rapid population growth in developing countries. Regardless of one's valuation or interpretation of this change, this is evolution. A characteristic that decreases genetic representation in future generations is genetically maladaptive. If the Western experiment in liberal democracy is measured by the standards of evolutionary biology, a long-term trend of genetic maladaptation is observable as descendants of European ancestry are biologically outproduced by descendants of non-European ancestry. The fertility of married women in most Northwest European countries, for example, has been declining since the late 19th century. Is there a reason why the systematic application of political equality is correlated with a systematic decline in genetic adaptation? While Darwin's theory represents a classic triumph of Western science, the impact of his understanding of the place of the human in nature did not alter the fundamental liberal democratic political principles of the society he was born into. It was the Nazis, rather, that attempted to biologize politics. While liberal democracy was built on pre-Darwinian ideas, it won the Darwinian struggle for political existence against the Nazis. Yet if reason cannot fundamentally determine values, the individual premise of liberal democracy is not in itself rational. The rationality of liberal democracy is premised upon assuming this premise of individual right, and then reasoning forward from it. But it is not only that human rights are not fundamentally rational. A socio-biological adaptationist correction of these old Enlightenment assumptions reveals that systematic individualism leads logically to a program of rational genetic self-destruction. While individual organisms evolved as a means of propagating their selfish genes, Western individualism subverts the selfish genes by valuing each human organism as an end. The goodness of genetically maladaptive behavior turns out to be a fundamental tenet of Western American civic religion. Since it is less than obvious, from an evolutionary perspective, that this should be the case, the situation begs the question of how this civic religion evolved in the first place. Why do Western civic values result in treating genetic interest with negligence? How can one explain the West's genetically suicidal behavior? Why is it that the genetic population that produced Charles Darwin apparently values genetically maladaptive behavior? Robert Fitzroy was the sea captain of the Beagle, the famous vessel that carried Charles Darwin across the world as he uncovered evidence for his theory of evolution. I never before came across a man whom I could fancy being a Napoleon or a Nelson, Darwin wrote to his sister. I should not call him clever, yet I feel convinced nothing is too great or too high for him. His ascendancy over everybody is quite curious. His peculiar ascendancy or mastery over Darwin and everyone else seemed to be linked to his views on slavery. The biologist explained that Fitzroy defended and praised slavery, which I abominated. Darwin did not like Fitzroy. 1222. While Fitzroy was the product of a distinctly aristocratic class, Darwin was the product of a more non-aristocratic class. While I should make it perfectly clear that one do not know the literal genealogical descent of Darwin or Fitzroy in specifically ethnic terms, their disagreement fits a familiar pattern. Fitzroy's views on slavery are characteristic of a more Norman view, while Darwin's abomination of slavery is characteristic of a more Anglo-Saxon view. Is it possible that their sharp disagreement over slavery was related to their class relationship to one another? Was Darwin's strong opposition to slavery rooted in opposition to the Norman mastery that began in 1066? Was Darwin a descendant of what American slavery advocate George Fitzhugh called the Saxon slave race? It may be that Darwin's very proclivities towards industry and objectivity were superior to those of a man like Fitzroy, precisely because embodying, as opposed to observing, superlative genetic adaptation strategies also tends to be correlated with scientifically distorting forms of subjectivity. In any case, opposition to slavery is not a universal position that can in any way be derived from evolution by natural selection in general. Darwin's decidedly anti-slavery or pro-rights convictions may have been the product of a local adaptation to historical circumstances. It is at least possible that Darwin's emphasis on the common strategy of adapting to or reacting to external circumstances, as opposed to the uncommon strategy of mastering or overcoming external circumstances, may be social or political reflections of his own class traditions. There is a logical and natural conflict between human rights and natural selection. The notion of the survival of the fittest conflicts with principle that everyone has the right to survive. Survival of the fittest implies acceptance that the unfit will not be granted the right to survive, while human rights tends toward the progressive abolition of natural selection. Though human rights were once thought to be natural rights, its natural basis could never be natural selection in itself. The principle of the universal right to life is, in principle, the end of Darwinian selective survival. On the basis of Darwin's discovery of natural selection, there is no basis for the assumption that all human beings should be granted the right to live. The universal right to live implies the end of natural selection via death, and thus the beginning of the end of the single most important means of biological evolution before humans: natural selection. While biological evolution, differential gene reproduction, occurs regardless of human rights, the progressive egalitarianism correlated with human rights generally promotes values opposite of kin selection, genetically adaptive discrimination, and a purely biological valuation of men and women as genetic replicators. Since it is differential reproductive success between generations that produces biological evolution, the combination of rights and progressive egalitarianism act as active antagonists to the conditions that can promote unequal reproductive success. The universal right to life promotes the right to universal indifference to biological evolution. Biological evolution continues nonetheless, since some genes continue to be propagated more successfully than others. Political rights, however, imply the prohibition of political control over biological evolution. One of the very greatest empirical proofs of the conflict between human rights and natural selection is the example of the Nazi Revolution against human rights. The Nazi Revolution was founded on an explicit valuation of biology and race. Darwin's discoveries were an intellectual pillar of the Nazi Revolution. Before Darwin, there was no significant debate over the sanctity of human life inherited from Judeo-Christian value, traditions. 1223 While human rights lack a fundamentally rational basis, secularized Judeo-Christian values formed the civilizational basis that human rights were able to develop upon. Darwin's discovery of evolution by natural selection brought this historical cultural convergence into question. Hans Joachim Koch, in a German work on social Darwinism, concluded that natural selection called into question the validity of the hitherto existing ethical ideas in all areas of life, whether social, economic, or political. 1224 Darwin and most Darwinists, wrote Richard Weikart in From Darwin to Hitler, denied the existence of an immaterial and immortal soul, a central tenet of the Judeo-Christian worldview that undergirded the sanctity of human life. 1225 Questioning the secularized basis of the sanctity of human life questioned the rational basis of human rights. The humanitarian nonsense, declared early 20th century German anatomist Hermann Kloch, which grants equal rights to all on the premise of the unity of humanity, is to be condemned from the scientific standpoint. 1226 In the late 19th century, German biologist Oskar Schmidt concluded, the principle of evolution is certainly the abolition of the principle of equality. 1227 What is the evolutionary significance of equal rights? How can one make sense of the humanist right to life in light of evolution? Through natural selection, the idea of human rights has demonstrated a remarkable survival success in its great political battles for cultural survival. Yet should human rights nonetheless be completely abandoned if it possesses no fundamental biological basis? Either this old idea of rights must be completely abandoned scientifically, or it must be reconstituted on a scientifically sound basis. I do think that rights can be reconstituted on a scientifically sound basis. If reason, in itself, cannot determine fundamental values, then reason could have derived any values as enlightened values. Yet these particular values underlying human rights have proved to be durable promoters of human peace, not accidentally, and not randomly, but precisely because they counter specific mechanisms of an ancient war for survival. It is precisely because human rights work in direct opposition to natural selection that human rights constitute the logical structural foundation for civilizational evolution. Human rights constitute a political framework for progressively ending biological selection and advancing cultural technological evolution. Within the history of the evolution of life on Earth, liberal democracy can be understood as a transitional form between biology and technology. As a political form, it moderates the extremes of both biological evolution and technological evolution as technology gradually takes precedence over biology. The transition between biological evolution and technological evolution is defined by at least three basic components. First, human rights, and especially the foundational right to live, acts as a foundational antagonist of the key mechanism of biological evolution, natural and artificial selection. Second, a general trajectory of egalitarian progress decreases the influence of biology and promotes a political framework wherein mechanisms of cultural technological evolution can advance unimpeded, i.e. the capitalist free market. Third, the previous two conditions culminate in a point wherein technological evolution overtakes biological evolution, i.e. the technological singularity. The process that leads from the first steps towards human rights to the singularity cannot be separated from some notion of progress, precisely because the progressive elimination of selection inversely reflects the gradual evolutionary process that brought biological life to a post-biological level. Modernity was the beginning of the end of the age of biology, the beginnings of consciousness of an exponential rate of post-biological change. While conventional conventionally identified with the 17th century scientific technological revolutions. Modernity first began with the human capacity for culture. The tabula rasa premise of liberal democracy does not refute the evidence for biological factors in human behavior, but it does implicitly maximize cultural technological evolution while minimizing biological evolution. While the Nazis redefined the radical political right as biological radicalism, the radical left leads to technological radicalism. In between these extremes lay biotechnology and the re-engineering of the old DNA framework. While these will ultimately be unable to compete with the speed, accuracy, and competencies of post-biological forms, in the shorter term, new biological inequalities, new forms of genetic aristocracy, and new gods may rage against the dying of the biological form. Modernity began with the proposition of the supremacy of nurture over nature. The heirs of modernity are about to find out if they really believe this. The singularity, the technological creation of a greater than biological intelligence, would stand as the fulfillment of modern values. The existence of machine intelligence trillions of times greater than all biological human intelligence combined will likely mark the end of the era in which our species could call itself the dominant life form on Earth. Nurturists may be vindicated in their disbelief in the importance of genes through the literal political supremacy of artificial intelligence, the products of human civilization, over biological humans. Belief in the supremacy of nurture over nature may ultimately be vindicated through technology's ultimate supremacy over the entire human race. That would be the overcoming of the influence of the genes altogether.